focus then from the US, certainly Witkoff, as we heard, on this potential security guarantee, possibly from the US and its European allies, in terms of a win coming through with the conversations between the Presidents Trump and Putin. At least that's how it's being framed by Witkoff. We know, though, that Russia is going to be seeking those territorial concessions. What do you think really stands out? What are the key takeaways as we lead up to this crucial meeting later today in Washington?
Yeah, Tom, I mean, there's a lot to unpack from that meeting on Friday, but there's also even more we don't still know about it. What I think is interesting is, of course, the symbolism for everybody here in Brussels, where you still have a Ukrainian flag flying behind me because Zelensky was here yesterday meeting with Ursula von der Leyen, was the red carpet for President Putin on American soil, sharing a podium with Donald Trump. That, obviously, from the sort of headline perspective, is the thing that has caught most of the concern for the European allies here. I think, though, the most significant thing that we've learned over the last 48 hours since that meeting is exactly what Witkoff was talking about in that interview that he did over the weekend, which was basically saying for the first time very explicitly that the United States is willing to give some of those security guarantees to Ukraine in the event of a peace deal going forward. What do those security guarantees actually look like? That is still an open question. But what he is intimating effectively is Article 5 kinds of protections for Ukraine under NATO without them joining NATO. So this is effectively a sort of NATO-light arrangement in the event of a further attack by the Russians into Ukraine, that the United States would come to the support of Ukraine. Now, if that is in fact the case, two things to make there. The first point is that that is a very significant step forward. That is something that the United States has refused to explicitly say going forward. But the real question is, Tom, why does that require Russian consent? That is sort of backstop of Article 5 to NATO is something that is unilaterally imposed by NATO allies for their own allies. That is not something that requires Russian consent. It is, of course, helpful for the Russians to say, we understand this, and we're going to put this into sort of Russian legislation enshrinement, which, of course, what that's actually worth is another question. But for the United States, that is something that they could have willingly, up until this point, said that they're willing to give Ukraine without those discussions with Putin. So that side of it is a little bit unclear, though it is a significant development.
Right, the idea that you need sign-off from Moscow for those security guarantees that you can effectively put in place should you be sitting in, of course, Washington and inside the White House. Ollie, when it comes to the response from Zelensky, you talked about the fact that, of course, he was on the ground in Brussels meeting with Ursula von der Leyen and others. Let's take a listen to what he had to say, particularly around the sanctions challenge for Russia, at least the Ukrainian perspective. Let's listen in to the Ukrainian president.
Since the territorial issue is so important, it should be discussed only by the leaders of Ukraine and Russia at the trilateral Ukraine, United States, Russia. So far, Russia gives no sign that trilateral will happen. And if Russia refuses, then new sanctions must follow.
So, Ollie, I guess the key question is territorial changes, territorial concessions, maybe from both sides, but also the willingness or not of this president, President Trump, actually to enact those sanctions that he's threatened.
Absolutely, but even the tone that you had over the weekend with Trump and Putin on Friday, they were talking about potential for economic cooperation going into the future. So, of course, sanctions are one question, but that's sort of the different from the perspective that we heard from those two leaders over the last few days. What we will say on the question of the territory, this is a very, very thorny question, as you know, Tom. Any sort of territorial concessions made by Ukraine are unlikely to be sort of legally recognized by Ukraine. I don't know, it would be sort of a de facto potential acknowledgement that these are regions that are no longer under Ukrainian control without a sort of legal backing for it. But again, we know from the very beginning when Trump came in to be president of the United States and his view on Ukraine that he was going to take what generously people would call a much more pragmatic approach, what the Europeans would call as a much less principled approach in terms of resolving the situation in Ukraine. The reality is that Russia holds a large proportion, a large majority of some of these regions, and that is something that we know from the beginning that Trump was willing to put on the table. The question then comes to the European side. Are they going to be willing to play ball on sanctions, on potential sanction relief going into the future? Let's also not lose sight of the fact that for the Europeans, as far as they're concerned, they have paid trillions of dollars in terms of the sanctions because of the sort of gas, the the resources that are no longer flowing in. It has become a great personal cost to the Europeans, so they're going to be loath to sort of roll that back without any sort of concrete resolution to this crisis. And I have to say that despite the fact that there has been some significant steps forward, it is hard to see still today how that gets resolved in its totality.